Hello everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. We're going to be getting started with the talk very shortly, but first I would love to tell you about some upcoming events with the California Labor Lab. Next month on Wednesday, October 25th, we'll have a presentation on The Future of Work is Now, first results from the California Work and Health Survey, and that will be with Dr. Edward Yellen. The California Labor Lab has also started a blog. I invite you to check out our first posts on the complex reality of the California labor market and manifestations of indirect wage theft. I'm going to include a link to that in the chat if you're interested in learning more about the blog. And on behalf of the California Labor Lab and NIA Center of Excellence for Total Worker Health, we're pleased to welcome you to today's webinar. A few housekeeping items before we get started. You will be muted during the presentation. If you'd like to ask a question, please enter it into the online Q&A box, and there will be time saved at the end of the presentation to address as many questions as possible. This presentation is being recorded and will be made available on the California Labor Lab and Center for Occupational and Environmental Health YouTube page within the next 5 business days. And all participants who logged in with their registration email for the full live presentation today will receive an email tomorrow with a link to the evaluation form that will qualify you for a certificate of completion with 1 continuing education contact hour. And once the evaluation form is completed, you'll be able to access and print your certificate. And it's my pleasure to hand it over to Dr. Edward Yellen to introduce our speaker for today.
Thanks, Michelle, and welcome all. It's a distinct pleasure to introduce Kristen Harknett. When we were starting the California Labor Lab, it was natural to seek her and her colleague Daniel Snyder from the Shift Project out because they're doing such important work on the impact of shifts and other forms of precarity of employment on the well-being of the workforce. Kristen is a professor of social and behavioral sciences here at UCSF and also on the faculty of Institute for Health Policy Studies here. The Shift Project, which she began with and continues to work on with Daniel, is a large-scale survey and research study of low-wage workers in the service sector, which maps the connections between schedule instability and other working conditions and worker well-being for its impact on worker well-being. Drawing on her research, she has provided invited testimony to inform federal, state, and local policymaking around fair work week regulations, including the Federal Schedules That Work Act and legislation in several states, including California and other localities. Her research also includes examinations of access to paid sick leave in service sector workplaces, gender and racial inequalities in working conditions, and use of technology in the surveillance in the service sector. So without further ado, Kristen, we're looking forward to your talk.
Thank you so much for setting the stage and for that kind introduction. It's always great to have an opportunity to share research and work with the California Labor Lab under Ed's able leadership. So I want to thank Ed, and I also want to thank Michelle Meyer for all of her work behind the scenes to put together this series. In today's talk, I'm going to share my slides, and I'm going to be talking about a new policy database that we have assembled with the support of the California Labor Lab. Bear with me for one moment while I get my slides going. The state and policy database that I'll describe today was assembled through the painstaking efforts of the research team, foremost Rebecca Wolf, who's joining us today and will hopefully join for the Q&A at the end. The talk today will touch on the starkly unequal landscape of labor protections across place. And along the way, I'm going to give some research examples of how differences in state and local policies matter a great deal for the well-being of workers. The policy database I'll describe is part of the work of the California Labor Lab. And so I'll spend just a moment orienting you on where we fit into this larger undertaking. So the California Labor Lab is a NIOSH Center of Excellence for Total Worker Health. It is a collaboration across organizations, including UCSF, UC Berkeley, and the California Department of Public Health. The California Labor Lab is the site of 3 large research projects, of which Daniel Schneider and my project is one. And there are also 8 new exciting pilot grant awards that are just getting underway. So the project circled in red in the lower left corner is the project that Danny Schneider and I work on as part of the California Labor Lab. And here we're really focused on inequalities in job conditions in the service sector, especially across race, ethnic, and gender groups. And as we investigate working conditions for low-wage workers generally, and also inequalities in these working conditions, we recognize that workers are subject to very different state and local regulatory environments. And this has led us, for our own purposes, to compile a database of state and local policies, but also then to share this as a public resource. Before getting into the details of our policy database, I wanted to place this work in its broader context. And at the very broadest level, we can think about the US's system of federalism, where power is shared between national, state, and local governments. And under this federalist system, states and localities have quite widespread regulatory authority to act, especially in the absence of federal action. And in fact, in recent years, recent decades, in the area of labor regulations, we've seen a real stagnation of action at the federal level, creating a big vacuum in which state and localities have sometimes stepped in. At the same time, over the past few decades, we've seen working conditions become increasingly precarious. We've seen an erosion in the purchasing power of wages. We've seen an erosion of fringe benefit packages, and also widespread job insecurity and schedule instability. And the past decade has also been characterized by a growing political polarization, which we've all been subject to through the COVID pandemic, through the Trump administration, through a lot of political debates and policymaking wars between policies that protect immigrants and trans workers and those that restrict their rights, all of which I'll touch on in the policy database. But to continue with this setting of the stage, just to give an example of the stagnation, the stalling out of action at the federal level. If we think about minimum wages, which are a very salient measure of job quality, we've seen no action at the federal level since 2009, and the federal minimum wage remains $7.25. In the area of access to leave from work, for health or caregiving reasons, we haven't seen any federal action since the Family and Medical Leave Act way back in 1993. With the exception of some temporary measures during the pandemic, we haven't seen any movement in leave access at the federal level. But when it comes to wages, for example, we've seen lots of movement at the state and local level and an acceleration of this action in recent years. Going back to the federal level, we've seen no action on paid sick leave access in spite of continued introduction of legislation year after year, every year since 2004. This legislation has failed to pass at the federal level. And in the absence of that federal action, we've seen a real growth and expansion of paid sick leave mandates at state and local levels. Here, the shaded areas show localities that have taken action to require employers to provide some paid sick leave to their workers. A recent article by Jennifer Montez in the Milbank Quarterly argues that the heterogeneity in the policy landscape introduced by inaction at the federal level and then uneven action at state and local levels has real consequences for population health. And in this article, Montez says that as states absorbed more policy-making authority through devolution and preemption. Their policy contexts hyperpolarized along partisan lines. And one consequence of this hyperpolarization is that the state in which one resides has a potentially profound impact on one's livelihood and health. So inspired by that statement and that argument that this policy unevenness, this heterogeneity and inequality has real consequences, really matters for population health. So with that, I'll turn now to what we have compiled and what we will make publicly available. So the spirit of the policy database that we have compiled is we're aiming here to systematically organize and report on policies that impact labor conditions and worker rights across US states and counties. The period that we've covered so far encompasses 2013 to 2022, a period in which there was a lot of action, as we'll see. Our data is organized in a couple of different ways. We have a database that describes all of the action at the state level and a separate database that describes all of the action at the county and the city levels. In each case, we have detail month by month by month over this 10-year period. So a data analyst can see when a policy went into effect and can analyze the effects or the associations after policies change. We are preparing a GitHub site that will host the data. And the data right now covers 4 topical domains. There's a set of measures of labor policies to raise the floor, which I'll describe. A set of policies related to protections based on gender identity that are especially relevant for trans non-binary workers. We have policies that capture undocumented workers' rights, and then we also capture policies related to COVID. Today, I'm going to talk about the first 3. The sources for our database, we're building on the good work of many other organizations and institutions, the ones listed here. And we see our value add as to gather this good work together in one place across many domains, and to prepare the data in such a way that it's straightforward to merge with other sources of information, perhaps at the individual level. Another part of the value add is that we didn't just stop with external resources, but rather we spent time augmenting, checking, and adjudicating when these sources disagreed. And by we, I mostly mean Rebecca Wolf, who really did the heavy lifting in compiling the data, checking the data, and doing a really meticulous job. As I mentioned, Rebecca is hopefully going to make an appearance during the Q&A. But she spent a lot of time going through municipal codes and really trying to get clear and nail down what the rights are in different geographies. So now getting into it, with the first domain that we captured, we measure in our database, both at the state and the local levels, a set of labor policies that are designed to raise the floor on working conditions. So the most familiar probably is the state and local minimum wage ordinances that raise the minimum wage above the $7.25 that's stipulated at the federal level. And we'll see there's been a lot of action in that area. We also capture state and local paid sick leave mandates, paid family and medical leave, and secure scheduling ordinances, which require employers to give their workers a certain amount of advance notice or pay them extra for last-minute schedule changes. So all of those policies are reflected here in the blue text. At the same time, we also capture policy making that tries to prevent localities from raising the floor. So we have seen in the past few years a real increase in states using preemption to prevent localities from passing their own minimum wage or paid sick laws. Now, historically, preemption was used more as a harmonization or simplification tool, but we've really seen a growth in the past decade of preemption being used to curb labor regulation activity. So in a moment, I'm going to turn to, so in the red text here, we capture preemption of local minimum wage, paid sick leave, paid family medical leave, and secure scheduling action that at the state level. And I use color coding throughout the presentation, where blue is generally going to represent either policies that raise the floor or enshrine worker protections. And the red text and the red coding is going to represent either policies that preempt that type of policy action or actually restrict worker rights based on their identities. And in the next slide, I'm going to turn to a map that gives you a sense of the landscape and how it's changed. The map is also going to be color coded with blue. Darker shades of blue is going to reflect more of these policies that raise the floor. As the shades of red get darker, that's going to represent more preemption policies. And then you're going to see some purple areas where there's a mixture of policies that raise the floor, but then also preemption policies that prevent local levels from raising the floor any higher. And this is an experiment and it's working. So we have some animated maps here, and these are going to cycle through and show you how the landscape has changed between 2016 and 2022. So starting here, we see a lot of light blue, and then we see the blue get darker. We see an expansion and a darkening of some of the red areas. And so the expansion of the blue and the darkening and the expansion of the red and the darkening really signals some polarization in the policy landscape, where we've simultaneously seen an extension of more policies that raise the floor, but at the same time in other geographic locations, an expansion of policies that prevent raising the floor at more local levels. And taking a look at a static picture from the end of 2022, we can linger here for a moment and get a sense of the general landscape. And it's probably not too surprising to note that along the West Coast and in portions of the Northeast, we see a lot of dark blue. So those are the places where we see the most robust protections for workers, the most conjunction of policies that raise the floor on wages, paid leave, and sometimes secure scheduling. The purple states, as I mentioned, are the states where there's been some action to raise the floor, but then also some preemption to say that localities can raise the floor no further. We also see a vast sort of red area in the South, where many of those states have preempted policy action and have done nothing to raise the floor. So here we can start to get a sense of how workers employed in the very same types of jobs face a very, very different set of regulatory environments depending on where they live and where they're employed. And if we boil this down to a simple tally at the state level, we can see that in the most recent period, there's been a lot of action on minimum wage in both respects, both on raising the floor and preempting raising the floor on wages. And we also see a fair amount of action on both sides when it comes to types of leave. We also in our policy database capture county level policy action. And here this has been primarily action around raising wages and stipulating that workers should be entitled to at least some paid sick leave. And so over the past few years, especially in some regions, like in the usual suspects like California, we see some local action to raise the floor. And looking at the most recent snapshot from December 2022, we can get a sense that There's been some sub-state policy action, but the bulk of the action has really occurred at the state level. So turning now to a second domain, our policy database also captured a set of policies that particularly pertain to undocumented workers. Now, there are a set of protective policies coded in blue. So some states and localities designated themselves sanctuary states or cities. And this meant that a place would actively support undocumented immigrants. This included laws that would limit the transfer of information regarding immigration status of individuals. For instance, not contacting federal immigration authorities to report undocumented residents. There were also protective policies passed in some states and localities that limited the cooperation with ICE, the Immigration Enforcement Agency. And there were also state laws that ensured that irrespective of your documentation of your immigration status, you had access to professional licensure that would allow you to enter the occupation that you were trained for. Then we also saw policy action in other places that banned sanctuary status in their location, required cooperation with ICE, and also required that employers at the public or the private level verify immigration status, verify that a worker had work authorization before they could be hired. And just to give an example of how policies like these may matter for worker well-being, this is just one research article example that used a set of policies not unlike the ones that we've captured here, and showed that in places that had more criminalization for undocumented workers, that had a chilling effect on healthcare access, and that those workers were less likely to be seeking the healthcare that they needed. When we analyze the data that we compiled in our database at the state level, we see that there is a lot of consistency across the policy, the granular policies, that the places that passed protective policies, one type of protected policy tended to pass other types of protective policies. And likewise, the places that passed the more restrictive or hostile policies tended to pass a bundle of them. So we do see a lot of polarization into those places that have a set of supportive policies and those that have more hostile policies for undocumented workers. And in our animated map, we can see, during the Trump administration from 2016 onwards, we can see a growth in both protective policies and hostile policies that follow a similar pattern overlapping to what we saw with the policies that either raise the floor or preempt raising the floor for all workers. And then freezing this at the most recent snapshot in December 2022, we can see that again along the West Coast and in some of the usual Northeast states, we see a bundle of supportive policies that provide more access to employment for undocumented workers along the West Coast and the Northeast. And then in those southern states, we see a preponderance of the hostile policies like ICE enforcement, banning sanctuary states, and requiring E-Verify. One state that looks a little different between the raise the floor map and this map is Arizona. Although Arizona is a state that raised the floor on their labor conditions generally, it was also a state where immigration was very contentious, and it's a state that has a set of hostile policies towards undocumented workers. At more local levels, we see an increase over time in restrictive policies, especially in border states, especially in Florida and Texas, and somewhat in Arizona. if we look at the most recent snapshot, we can see here is the landscape. At the local level, there have been a fair number of policies passed, and we see not so much along the West Coast, but these restrictive policies along the borders. And then if we do again a sort of summing up or a tally to get the big picture across the nation of this trend in polarization, we can just look at the average number of either anti-immigrant or pro-immigrant policies year by year by year. And we see that as time marches on, we see more and more pro-immigrant policies and more anti-immigrant policies over time. So a strong pattern of polarization where the experience of being an undocumented worker has become more varied depending on where you work over the past decade. The final policy domain that I'll discuss has to do with the civil rights of trans non-binary workers. So these are policies that either protect or restrict the rights of workers by their gender identities. So here we capture one protective policy at the state and the local level, and that is the inclusion of gender identity in anti-discrimination protections. Then we also capture a set of more hostile or restrictive policies, those banning anti-discrimination by gender identity, those providing a religious exemption where it allows certain groups or institutions to discriminate based on gender identity. And then we also capture two other policy areas that have been much in the news. They're a little less common, but they're very salient. And that is the so-called don't say gay policies that restrict the ability to incorporate anything along the lines of gender identity or sexual orientation in school curriculum. So it's a ban on discussion of these topics in the lower grades. And then there are also some bathroom ban bills that happened in a few states that restrict access to bathrooms based on the sex assigned at birth. And just to give an example here of how these policies matter for actual individuals in the real world, this recent article in the American Journal of Preventive Medicine draws a connection between these types of policies and healthcare utilization of transgender people in the United States. Similar to the article example for undocumented workers, the more restrictive policy environments have a chilling effect on getting needed health care. And we do see that the places that have some restrictive policies tend to have a number of restrictive policies, and we see a growth in these types of policies over time at the state level and at the local level. And if we look at the snapshot from December 2022, all of the blue states, these represent places where the anti-discrimination legislation encompasses gender identity. And there's been no legislation that excludes or exempts. The purple states have a conflict where they have that gender identity as a protected category, but they also have hostile policies as well, perhaps a religious exemption or one of the other policies I mentioned. And here we again see this region of the South as one where we see the most hostile policies. Interestingly, when we turn to the local level, we see in Florida is a very hotly contested state where there are restrictive policies at the state level. Florida is one of the few states that has the don't say gay restriction in the educational system, and has been much in the news for a lot of their restrictive policies. But at the same time, at the local level, there's been some pushback where there have been local ordinances passed to say that there can't be discrimination based on gender identity. And so that's what we see here in the most recent time series, all this policy action in Florida. And then just doing a tally, we see over time, there really has been a lot of action across all of the domains that I've been talking about, but we see an increasing number of states over the past decade who add or enshrine anti-discrimination by gender identity into law. And at the same time, we see a growth in anti-LGBTQ policies over that same time period. Okay, at this point, I'm going to, in this kind of format, I'm speaking into the void. I can't really see anybody. So this is my check to make sure that proof of life out there beyond the void. I'm going to ask people to, in the chat, place their guesses. If we think about going to extremes, the state where workers experience the highest labor standards and the most protections, and the state where workers have the lowest floor and the most restrictive or hostile policy environment. I wonder if I can ask people in the chat to just place their guesses. I see. I'm heartened to see that there's some activity in the chat. Thank you for participating. I'm going to take a quick peek to see where we're at. Okay. Thank you for playing. And I think, the answer that I'm going to give comes from, the policies that we have compiled and collected. And there are some close seconds here. So when I'm looking at the guesses, if you're not right on, you're probably, getting the second or the third place in their category. But if you guessed California as the best state, you were right. California really stands out across the board, having all the labor protections and none of the restrictive or hostile policies. At the other end of the spectrum, Tennessee takes the award for having the lowest floor and the most restrictive policy environment. Pretty much across the board, both of these states run the board, but in a very, very different way. So in California, the minimum wage at the state level is $15.50, and there are a number of states, localities that have their own minimum wage ordinances on top of that. California at the state level has paid sick leave. They have paid family and medical leave. And although at the state level, they don't have a fair work week ordinance, which requires a certain amount of advance notice, several of the cities in California, including Los Angeles and San Francisco, San Jose, have legislation that raises the floor on schedules and fair work week. California is one of the states that has protection, anti-discrimination protection based on gender identity. California is a sanctuary state that says that they won't cooperate with ICE in enforcement, and they offer access to professional licensure, occupational access, regardless of immigration status. At the very, very, very end of the spectrum, defining the low road, is Tennessee, which has not raised the minimum wage, as 30 states have, including Florida, which Florida I feel like is the Walmart of states, where when we think about bad states, we often think about Florida because they're in the news a lot. But Florida actually has a higher than federal minimum wage, but Tennessee does not. Tennessee also has preempted all local policy action for wages, for paid sick, for paid family medical leave, and for Fair Work Week. They prohibit anti-discrimination by gender identity. They have a religious exemption, don't say gay, and a bathroom ban. Also, for undocumented workers, they've banned sanctuary state or localities. They say that they will cooperate with immigration enforcement, and they require verification of immigration status for employment. So you can start to see, in the SHIFT project, which I, where we've been working at that for many, many years. And a lot of what we do is kind of compare conditions across companies. And so it's very striking to think about workers who work at the very same company in California versus Tennessee are going to face such radically different sets of working conditions because of the starkly different regulatory environments. So at this juncture, I think I have time to spend just a few minutes giving one example of an application of this policy database. So the real vision here, I think there's a lot that we can do and a lot that we can learn just descriptively by looking across the different policy domains and characterizing geographies as we've just done in this talk. But the vision for this database also encompasses that we can now take this policy information, merge it with other information, perhaps at the individual level about individuals' health or well-being or job satisfaction or any kind or healthcare utilization, as we saw in some of the research article examples. And so I'll talk for just a moment about one example of a way that we have taken this policy information and how it varies across time and across place, linked it with information from a worker survey to then understand how paid sick leave mandates may diffuse across companies. And so the question at hand in this research was, when a large company, a Walmart or a McDonald's, is subject to a paid sick leave mandate for much of their workforce, but not all of their workforce, do they just go ahead and voluntarily expand that paid sick leave coverage everywhere, perhaps because it makes things simpler? So that was the question we were interested in. And it really did require this blending of the policy information on the one hand, and then these other data sources that we've been collecting in parallel. So the interesting idea here, the intriguing idea, is that because of federalism, because of all this heterogeneity across place, we have what Brandeis referred to as a laboratory of democracy, that we have like this experiment. We can see what is it like when a state does one thing versus another thing. And part of this vision about laboratories of democracy is that some states, like California, could kind of lead the way. They could be proof of concept, and then other states would follow suit. So, and that's been an important research question that a lot of people have looked at. When one state does passes a set of policies, does it spill over and do other states follow suit? And maybe does it spill up, and does then the federal government take action? But we were interested in a somewhat different question in our paper. We wanted to know at the company level, if a company like a Walmart or a McDonald's or a Target, if they have to cover a big share of their workers anyhow because of paid sick leave mandates in 16 different states where they operate, will they just say, well, we just want to keep things consistent, we're going to offer paid sick leave everywhere? And this idea kind of seems plausible when we think about the headache that this complex landscape may have for a large employer that's operating nationally. They've got to keep track. What do I have to do in California versus Tennessee versus all the places in between? And so one possibility is that companies could just take a higher road approach to make sure that they're compliant and just to simplify what they have to keep track of. And anecdotally, there are some cases where we absolutely see that that does happen. Starbucks is one example where they say, we're going to follow the most generous paid sick leave mandate in any place we operate, and then we'll just expand that, extend it to all Starbucks locations. And so in this research example, we take that policy database information on paid sick leave policies, and we put it together with reports from workers that we've been collecting since 2017 through Shift project surveys. And here we're targeting workers at large named employers. So those that do tend to operate nationally and operate in many different state environments with radically different policy requirements, as we've just seen. And in our survey, we ask workers about their access to paid sick days and other benefits. And we also ask them where their store is located. And that allows us to put together what we know about paid sick leave regulations at the state and the local levels with what workers are telling us about the benefits they have access to. And this is the landscape of paid sick leave benefits. We see that they're required all along the West Coast, all along the Northeast, but very few places in between. Nevertheless, these large employers that have locations in many, many different states have a lot of exposure in their workforce. They have to cover a pretty big share of their workforce because of the Northeast and because of the West Coast mandates. And this picture here shows that this is the percent of a workforce, company by company, that's subject to a paid sick leave mandate. And so we can see over here on the right, there are some companies that are getting pretty close to having to cover their whole workforce. So maybe it makes sense for them to say, you know what, we'll just go ahead and cover everybody, keep it simple. But that was the research question. So we put together the pieces here, and we do find evidence that as companies are subject to paid sick leave mandates for a greater share of their workforce, they do go ahead and voluntarily extend coverage, or at least they're more likely to voluntarily extend coverage, even when they don't have to. And so that's just one example of how we can take this policy information, put it together with another source, in this case, a worker survey, to show how policies really matter and make a difference and diffuse in their impacts. So I want to leave plenty of time for our Q&A, so I'll wrap up by just summing and recapping what I think is probably obvious by now, that we have a very heterogeneous state and local policy landscape along a lot of different domains. And over the past decade, we've seen growing polarization. I think we've probably, as individuals, all experienced the polarization if we pay attention to the news, but we really see it manifest, it show up in these maps, in the trends and the policies, both the restrictive ones and the supportive ones over time. All of this has led to very stark differences in protections across place that I think we have a lot of evidence and a lot of reason to think matter a great deal for healthcare access, for population health. Our hope is that by compiling this policy database, that we can facilitate more analyses of how state and local policy differences really matter and how they're influencing health and well-being. So hopefully today I've given you a pretty good sense of what we have to offer right now. In the future, we hope to continue to extend the time series because the landscape's ever changing. We have in mind to add a couple of new indicators, and we're always open to your good suggestions for other indicators we may entertain. And we'll continue to put pieces together to examine the consequences of these state and local policy differences. So in preparing the presentation, we've found just a few little things that we still have to fine tune and clarify in our documentation, but I expect that within the next couple of weeks, we will go live with our GitHub site where you can download the data yourself, get all the documentation to understand what we have to offer. So I share the link here. And if you have any follow-up questions, our project web email address is at the top. Mine is in the middle. Please feel free to get in touch. And I'll end by thanking our funders, our collaborators, and welcoming Rebecca Wolf, who did so much hard work to get us to where we are today. Thanks.
Great. This was just a tour de force, and for those of us who have survey data that is complete and will soon be geocoded, we're just really excited to take advantage of the hard work that you've done. We have a lot of questions in Q&A, and I will take them in the order in which they were sent. So the first question was, does your database include labor policies set by administrative bodies, for example, wage boards, industrial welfare commissions, and the like?
Rebecca, I don't know if you feel up for fielding that one.
So I focused on municipal code and local law for this one, and those were the sources I was pulling from. Would be really interesting to get into that next, but combing through municipal law took plenty of time. So
if the person who asked that question could share any more detail, if they think we might be missing anything, we're all ears.
Sure. If he unmasks himself, then. So another question started with a comment. This is really cool. And the anonymous person said, what does the white on the map mean in the context of your presentation?
Thank you. I meant to say that white means that there's been no policy making one way or another. So a white state neither has a protective policy nor a restrictive policy in that particular domain that we were looking at.
So the next question was, are the local policies purely at the county level? Were city ordinances also captured?
Yeah, this was one of the unanticipated complexities. Like we knew about this complexity. We didn't know how hard it would be to boil this down to a measure. So we did try to capture action at both the city and the county level. The way we decided to make the database tractable was to have our local level database be organized at the county level, but have separate indicators for county policies, and then any city within this county has a policy. And then a third measure of number of cities in this county that have that policy. So what I presented in the maps is the broadest measure of policy action within a county. It does not always mean that the entire county took that action. Sometimes it means a city within that county took that action.
I'm taking these questions in the order they came in, and the next one is a doozy. And it starts with some facts. California lost around 500,000 people for moving out since 2020, per USA Today. Tennessee gained approximately 83,000 people just last year, per Tennessee State Data Center. If these policies are, quote, hostile, why do people leave California and migrate to Tennessee?
The cost of living? I think that would be my quick answer. I think that's a really, I don't mean to be glib. I think it's a really intriguing, challenging, and important question. But I do think cost of living is a major factor that isn't necessarily captured in what I talked about today. We don't have any measures here really of cost of living and cost of housing and shortage of housing, but I have to believe that that plays a large role.
I should point out that there was a piece in the Times sometime in the last 48 hours that pointed out that when people move to new states, they bring the values from the state they were in. So for those of us who'd like to see some of these changes, maybe that's possible. And there's a lot of evidence in political science that Arizona and Nevada are becoming purple because of migration from not only California, but other blue states as well. So next question is, when collecting info from the SHIFT project respondents, how do you differentiate between differences in actual policies and incorrect reporting, understanding of those policies by respondents to the survey?
Mm-hmm. We really treat policy information and worker reports as different pieces of information. So policies are what they are, but we all, like all of us who work in this area at all, know that the devil's really in the details on the implementation. Things are not always implemented exactly to spec, as written in policy and in law. And employers don't always comply, workers don't always know. So we are not relying on workers to report on what is the policy in your city, what is the policy in your state. We don't think workers would be very reliable reporters of that information. Instead, we ask workers to report on their lived experience. And sometimes, sometimes they might perceive that they do or do not have access to a benefit, that on paper, there's a discrepancy. But we just take it at face value. The worker report is their experience or their perception.
So the next question is, how do you see this work extending to health impacts?
In a lot of different ways. And so I try to pull out or pepper in a couple of examples of how other researchers have linked the policy information in the database to life expectancy, in the case of the Milbank Quarterly article by Jennifer Montez, linked to having a usual source of care and healthcare utilization in a couple of examples of research papers that took policy information and linked it to, in the case of undocumented workers, they were looking at information from the National Health Interview Survey to understand if somebody had a usual source of care. So I think that there are many, many, many possibilities here. And our hope is that, we'll put this policy database out into the world, and then people who have surveys or working with electronic health records or just have information for individuals across different geographic contexts can then take advantage of this resource to make some new linkages.
So the next question is, what's the current role of ALEC, the Legislative Exchange, in designing and promulgating state legislation which opposes worker protections and rights? They were a leader in state preemption legislation, for example. These may be state laws, but the political landscape has been nationalized.
Right. I don't have a great answer to that, but I wish that whoever put that in the chat could say more. I think it's interesting. We didn't really get into why or the how of how these policies came to be in one place versus another. I think there are some sort of intriguing cases of purple states or discrepancies between what's happening at the state level and the local level that could give us like an entry point where then we dig in to understand the policymaking process. But so far that hasn't really been in the scope of this. So I would love to talk with you more and hear more thoughts about what you might have going in that area.
Since I've
whoever
known
asked
the
that question.
question writer for many decades, I can unmask him. It's Victor Rubin, who's the director of policy for the California Labor Lab, among many other roles that he's played in the policy link world. Big letters and small letters, policy link. So may the dialogue begin. In fairness to the other question writers, the next one is, will a conservative Congress bring more preemptive policies across the nation that will impact minorities?
Well, we certainly have seen an upward trend in the use of preemption. And so I don't see any reason why, if political control shifted to more in a more conservative direction, why that would abate. So I do think that it's something, but again, this is something that maybe Victor Rubin would be great to hear from on this, in terms of just the political landscape of the actors who might, and the actions that might try to slow down this preemption train.
So, and the next question is a great segue to think about the implications of this pathbreaking research. And it is, wonder if the project includes any attention to enforcement of protective laws.
Yeah. It's something that I am passionately interested in. So in some of the applied examples in our research, for instance, we took a really deep dive. Historically, the SHIFT project's been very, very interested in unstable schedules and fair work week legislation. And so we took a really deep dive into legislation in Seattle, where we did an evaluation. And they passed a law that said that large employers had to give 2 weeks advance notice, or pay predictability pay for changes on shorter notice. And you never see 100% compliance. So we looked before, we looked after. The law had its intended effects, but there's still a lot of room short of 100% compliance. And so I think in many, many cases, it's one thing to pass a law, it's another to see that law complied with. We see that very, very starkly in the paid sick leave space, where just having a paid sick leave law on the books is not enough to guarantee that a worker will use it, because at many of the workplaces that we study, service sector workplaces are chronically understaffed. And so even if you're entitled to paid sick leave, workers often feel intense pressure to work while sick, because there's nobody to cover for them, because their manager's desperate, they don't want to leave their coworkers in a lurch. So I think the enforcement is so important and so understudied. And some of these laws are only enforced, the non-compliance is only caught and enforced if a worker complains about it. And for a worker to complain about it, they have to know about it. So I think this is a really rich and important area of inquiry.
Well, and to emphasize that point, yesterday, the UCSF nursing workforce held an action outside the hospital here in Mission Bay to complain about understaffing relative to the standards for nurse-patient ratios. And of course, UC pleads it's hard to hire and keep people, and so the argument goes on. It's now just 2 minutes before the hour. Rebecca and Kristen, if you have some closing comments, that would be wonderful. In the interim, let me just thank you for not only a wonderful presentation, but a really important addition to the research literature that many of us will be able to take advantage of. So thank you. And closing comments from the two of you.
I have a couple closing comments, which is just, I want to thank all of the other organizations and institutions whose databases we we benefited from. It really gave us a leg up in putting this together. I also want to say that this undertaking was way more time consuming and complex than I ever imagined. And I would really appreciate if, I hope that people use this resource. And if and when you do, we would love to hear from you if you see any kind of oddities in the data. It's just incredibly hard to nail down all the details to our satisfaction. It's taken us a lot longer than we originally envisioned. So we'd be very grateful for any kind of crowdsourcing and input we get from users of the database. And we'd love to hear from you if you use it, and we'd love to see your future papers.
I will
Rebecca,
just second. I'll just second that real quick. This, yeah, took way more time than we anticipated. There are so many details, and you can only read municipal code documents for so long. So we would love to hear from you, any feedback, any oddities, and would really appreciate seeing where this goes and how it serves you. So let us know.
great. And with that, our hours come to a close. Thank you very much to our speakers, and thanks to our audience, who was fascinated because they stuck around in very high numbers. So great. Thank you.